focused on the weaponization of state and federal regulations against American farmers and ranchers. Agriculture has had a profound influence on my life. I'm a cattle farmer by trade and have deep-rooted understanding of the challenges farmers and ranchers face, such as price volatility, fluctuating markets, and unpredictable weather. Today's farmers, however, face a whole different set of challenges brought on by overburdensome regulations that puts the security of Americans' agricultural future at risk. Farmers and ranchers have had their livelihoods, property rights, and a way of life directly threatened by detrimental, excessive, and oftentimes meritless litigation directed towards farmers and landowners. Through evolving regulations, costly litigation, and in some cases criminal prosecution, the federal and state governments have waged a legal war against farmers all across America. The cumulative effect of this aggressive posture towards the farming community has resulted in an erosion of due process, private land rights, and the economic viability of family farming. Progressive and leftist administrations at all levels of government have failed agricultural producers. They have created a culture of systematic and selective lawfare intended to hurt the individuals that disagree with their misaligned agendas. Charles and Heather Maud of South Dakota are victims of this failure in leadership. During the Biden administration, Mauds were alerted by the U.S. Forest Service that fencing on their farm blocked access to the Buffalo Gap National Grassland. After notice, the Mauds agreed in good faith to a land survey. Despite their strides to work with the government to resolve this simple civil dispute, they were hit with a baseless and unnecessary criminal prosecution. The Mauds were indicted separately on federal property theft charges, facing up to 10 years in federal prison and charged with over $250,000 in fines. The civil dispute was over 50 acres of land, and the fence in question was built before Heather and Charles were even born. They were just trying to maintain their small hog and cattle farm on land that their family had worked on since the early 1900s. The charges against Heather and Charles were dropped sensibly by the Trump administration in 2025. This is unfortunately a common situation. The same thing is happening to family farms across the country. The King family faced a meritless case of agricultural lawfare by the radical government in the state of Washington. Wade and Teresa King's family have ranched the same land in Washington since the 1950s. Despite maintaining the land for decades, the Washington State Department of Ecology issued administrative orders claiming the King family violated the state's Water Pollution Control Act. These orders demanded restoration of the newly interpreted wetlands and levied a civil penalty of more than $266,000 and a $3.7 million restoration order against the King family. The wetlands in question were simply man-made stock ponds, which is a protected practice in Washington. Additionally, the stock ponds existed before Wade and Teresa King were even born. This is a bizarre attempt to force the King family to comply with an unintended and incorrect interpretation of the law. No family farm should be punished for a practice protected by state law. Their stock ponds were incorrectly identified as wetlands, and the Kings were forced to pay the price. The Kings are hardworking, law-abiding citizens, and the sudden reinterpretation of state law, turning our American farmers and ranchers into criminals, is flat out wrong. Both the Maud family and the King family ranch are a true testament to what the American dream means, and they do not deserve to be wrongfully prosecuted by radical governments. Thankfully, U.S. Secretary of Agriculture Rollins and President Trump have the backs of our great agriculture industry. Earlier this year, Secretary Rollins unveiled the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Farmer and Rancher Freedom Framework, an applicable common sense policy framework outlining how the federal government can reverse course on years of systematic lawfare against the agriculture industry. The framework contains 4 tenets to restore effective government programming and policy making related to the agriculture industry: protecting producers, preserving land and liberty, purging burdensome regulations, and being a strong partner for agriculture's future. Today's roundtable will allow us to converse with 3 individuals who have seen the harsh consequences of government overreach and overregulation firsthand within the agriculture industry. American farmers and ranchers are the backbone of our great nation, and they deserve to be able to farm freely without fear of wrongful, politicized prosecution from state and federal leaders. Make no mistake, overreach and weaponization of local, state, and federal governments will not be tolerated, no matter who is the target. The House Committee of Oversight and Government Reform will continue to work with the whistleblowers who have been subject to agricultural lawfare to bring justice to their stories while also helping reform policies that have been manipulated against them. We must protect and defend American agriculture at all costs. It has been an honor to work alongside the U.S. Department of Agriculture in these efforts. We welcome anyone across the aisle willing to join us in supporting Secretary Rollins and the Trump administration's initiatives to support this critical industry. I'm now pleased to introduce our roundtable guests. First, we have Marty Jackley. Mr. Jackley is the Attorney General for the state of South Dakota. He was elected for a fourth term as Attorney General in 2022 and has served as Chairman of the National Association of Attorneys General. Next, we have Shad Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan is the Private Property Rights Committee Chair for RCAF USA. As an American cattle rancher and fifth-generation agriculturalist, he has committed his career work to advocating for the industry. And finally, we have Margaret Byfield. Ms. Byfield is the Executive Director of the American Stewards of Liberty. She has been working to protect property rights since 1992. I welcome our panelists today and look forward to your discussion. And with that, I now yield to our ranking member, Garcia, for his opening remarks.
Thank you. And I also want to thank the presenters and the witnesses that are here for being here today. Now, unfortunately, I do have to announce that Democratic members will not be participating in today's hearing. This roundtable, which is really set up to have witnesses where we have no input on motions, where we have no input and no formal rules, and no ability to call witnesses, and also importantly, no ability to have motions to subpoena, I think is important to call out. Now, this is not a real hearing. It's one that's set up to appear like one. This is a roundtable designed without rules, rights, or accountability. And critically, no ability for members to make motions. What's happening today, in our opinion, is not real oversight. Now, Oversight Republicans have not held a public, full committee roundtable. As far as the last 3 years that I've been on this committee, there hasn't been a roundtable that's been set up. This is the first one. And we should be clear about why that's happening. Last week, Attorney General Pam Bondi skipped a legally required deposition to be before our committee. No communication, no compliance, and no accountability. Instead of enforcing the subpoena, the majority is canceling hearings altogether. It's not just happening in the full committee, but it's also happening in subcommittees. When we have real hearings, members from both parties have successfully forced votes and issued subpoenas. Now, since July 2025, the committee has made 7 successful subpoena motions, including 18 subpoenas, all with the support of bipartisan members of both the majority and the minority. And we know that this has not just, of course, been a Democratic effort, but Republicans have joined as well. Representatives Burchett, Perry, Luna, and Mace have all made successful motions which we have agreed are important as Democrats. And when members are given their full rights, this committee has been able to act. But someone wants to shut down hearings in oversight. Democrats will not participate in a process designed to strip members of their rights. We do encourage the majority to hold real conversations, to hold real hearings, and to do those immediately. But I do want to thank those members and witnesses that are here today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
It's unfortunate that the Democrats don't consider agriculture important to participate in this roundtable. I know the big city Democrats that are on the committee think food comes from a grocery store, but to be more specific, food comes from farmers. And our farmers are under attack by a weaponized government. So don't let the door hit you in the butts on the way out. We're gonna have a substantive discussion about agriculture. And I would like to welcome, I know he stepped out for a second, our great chairman of the Agriculture Committee, the chairman of the Agriculture Committee, G.T. Thompson, to participate in this today's very important roundtable. So I want to thank Chairman G.T. Thompson from Pennsylvania for being here. With that, will we, are there? All right, I know that you all will have some opening statements. I'll start with you, Mr. Jackley, and we'll go down the line. But thank you all for being here. We're very excited about about the roundtable today and very concerned about the warfare that we're seeing in my industry, the agriculture industry, and we look forward to hearing from you and hopefully having some good question and answers. So, Mr. Jackley.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and committee members, South Dakota Attorney General Marty Jackley, and I appreciate this opportunity. I come to you with a unique perspective. I've served as a U.S. attorney, I am the Attorney General, and I own a farm and a ranch. I come from a state where agriculture's king, it drives our economy, but I've seen instances where the court system has been used adversely against our farmers and ranchers. Two of those cases in South Dakota would be the Maud case that the chairman had mentioned, Charles and Heather Maud, as well as the over 100 ranchers on the Moreau River. Just briefly on the Maud case, I mean, that was a situation where the Mauds have a history of 5 generations ranching on their land. It became a situation where there was what I would refer to a civil dispute on a boundary, literally involving only about 50 acres. It was an area where the government had granted leases on previously, including the year before. A dispute arose because of a no hunting sign. Ultimately, U.S. Forest Service showed up. The Mauds were very cooperative. They took the no trespassing sign down. They agreed to a survey. They did what you would expect in ranch country, farmers and ranchers to try to work through the issue. But unfortunately, the government chose a heavy-handed approach. They issued criminal indictments separate for both Heather and Charles. It was a case that didn't need to go that direction. Thankfully, through efforts of Senator Mike Rounds, as well as Secretary Brooke Rollins, ultimately the criminal charges were dismissed, but they have continuing ongoing civil disputes regarding this area. In fact, today at 1 o'clock, my Attorney General team is meeting with our state Speaker of the House to try to work through and see where the Attorney General should be involved to try to end the lengthy litigation and challenges over these 50 acres. The second case is a little more complicated. It's the Moreau River. It is a case that I personally tried before I became Attorney General. I represented over 100 ranchers, and it is a case about disrespect of ranchers and private property interests, a disrespect for tribal trust responsibilities that the United States has. It's about disrespect for a cemetery back in the 1800s that U.S. veterans are laid to rest in, and it's a case about disrespect for the environment for what is done. The location of the Moreau River is on the Cheyenne Indian Reservation. Moreau River is a major tributary to that. The agencies that were involved were the Corps of Engineers and Department of Justice, Maine Justice. The South Dakota U.S. Attorney's Office was not involved in the case. And ultimately, it really began when the Hawaii project came in and built the Hawaii Dam. Began in 1958. It reached full pool capacity in 1968, but it was dropping sediment that ultimately began filling up certain areas, including the Moreau River. Where it really became challenging in 1960, the United States was building a bridge called the Promise Bridge. And the United States made a determination to cut 70 feet off the span of the bridge, creating a pinch point. And they did it to save about $100,000. And their justification in writing was because they didn't care what happened because this was an undeveloped area. It wasn't an undeveloped area because this is where the ranchers had their cattle operations. This is where there was a cemetery. There was a native community called Whitehorse. And because of that decision, ultimately, the Moreau River filled up with sediment from both the Hawaii project coupled with the pinch point. And it ultimately came to roost in 1997 when there was a major flood, cutting off access, killing massive amounts of cattle. There were stories about where young mothers had to take young daughters horseback across the river to save themselves, flooded over that cemetery developed back in the 1800s. It was a severe situation. The government's only solution was to provide sandbags. Ultimately, because the United States would not come in, a lawsuit was filed in 2003, and ultimately there was nothing but continuances, delay. the inappropriate use of settlement discussions, and the case was tried. At trial, the federal court claims judge ultimately held for liability against the United States and ultimately held that they were the proximate cause of sufficient injury, and that was back in 2022. As I sit here today, the United States still has not resolved that case. It has created major problems with the environment and other concerns. One of the biggest concerns I have as a lawyer is the arguments that the United States made. The United States, in complete disregard for its trust responsibility and ranchers, indicated that trust lands that involve ranchers and Native Americans, they have no property interest, which is contrary to the law and contrary to the history. And equally so on range units, and what a range unit is simply when you combine parcels of land to ultimately have a unit that it's set up by the BIA. They charge a fee for a 5-year lease on that. They ultimately determined and believed at the United States that that also is not a property interest. And so they put these ranchers basically in jeopardy of their farming operations by bad decisions. They did nothing to correct those decisions. They've used the civil courts to drag out litigation and ultimately disregarded long-established history of private property rights and tribal trust responsibilities. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, General. Mr. Sullivan.
Yeah, good morning. It's good to be here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm a little bit disappointed to see that both sides are kind of empty. I was hoping to teach, especially the Democrats, about liberty and freedom today, but I digress. My name is Shad Sullivan. I am an American cattle rancher. My family derives 100% of our income from the cattle and beef production. This legacy started over 120 years ago when my great-great-grandmother came to southeast Colorado to pursue her American dream through production agriculture. Over the next 70 years, her dream stood the test of time. Through God, family, and country, she prevailed with the understanding that ownership of her private property guaranteed her legacy through the American dream. Even then, she understood this truth: freedom and liberty are inseparable from the land. Today, I remain deeply rooted in that same land, but over the last 3 decades, I have witnessed a cultural shift in how Americans view the constitutional right to private property. This has been driven by ideological infiltration into our institutions. I call this the war on beef. At its core, it is an interwoven war on private property. It is a war on the charters of freedom. Secretary Rollins has defined agriculture lawfare as the use of administrative, legal, and legislative systems to adversely impact farmers and ranchers driven by political and environmental policy goals, carried out through excessive regulation, permitting, litigation, and penalties that ultimately inhibit production. To understand this war, we must ask who, how, and why. It is structured from the top down, being waged by a network of global elites who seek to control any and all means of production and natural resources. It is carried out through the infiltration of federal, state, and local governments, universities, corporations, and even agricultural trade organizations. Using conservation incentives and public-private partnerships, it reshapes the culture and restricts private property. Because the goal is to replace private ownership with centralized control of the major means of production and natural resources. Climate change is used as the crisis, sustainability is offered as the solution, but the result is production and consumption control and the total loss of personal and productive liberty. My family experienced this firsthand in 1999 through the first of its kind of a public-private partnership between the Colorado State Land Board and the Nature Conservancy forced us off our land. That fight cost us years and upwards of $10 million. But for me, it exposed the reality of bureaucratic overreach and corruption. Across the country, we're seeing the same pattern of land taken through eminent domain, grazing reduced, and operations pushed out through what can only be described as death by 1,000 cuts. Nevada rancher Wayne Hage's conflict with the U.S. Forest Service and the BLM ultimately led to the loss of his operation. The Hammond family of Oregon served prison time for protecting their homestead from a raging wildfire. In 2025, Secretary Rollins was instrumental in dropping the federal charges of South Dakota's Mod family. We've already talked about that. In the early 1980s, the federal government used eminent domain to acquire 250,000 acres in southeast Colorado for Pinyon Canyon Maneuver Site, and in 2006 saw another 700,000 acres. At the same time, a National Park Service employee leaked a plan to designate the region as a National Heritage Area without the landowner's consent. Today, efforts are underway in the same region through a partnership between the Colorado State Land Board, Colorado Division of Wildlife, and the U.S. Forest Service to implement the rewilding in the region. Similar cases have been documented across the West, including New Mexico's Goss family ranches, a 25-year affair, and the efforts to shut down ranching on Colorado's Point Reyes and Potter Valley dam removals. In Washington State, after cleaning out permit-exempt stock watering ponds used for watering livestock, the King Ranch is being fined $267,000 by the Department of Ecology. The Department of Natural Resources has canceled the family state grazing leases. These actions warrant oversight and a closer review by this committee, given the serious concerns they raise about the misuse of state authority through conspiracy, collusion, and financial fraud. It is the EPA Division, the Department of Natural Resources, the Pollution Controls Hearing Board, and the Department of Ecology. Environmental organizations have become highly effective in driving these federal and state land grabs. The Nature Conservancy has been at the forefront of these efforts, while the World Wildlife Fund, which has claimed that cattle are killing the planet, have also partnered with agricultural trade associations to influence policy. Many NGOs receive millions and millions in federal funding each year and use tactics like sue and settle to shape outcomes. Overlapping leadership between these organizations, government agencies, and universities creates a closed loop of influence that drives policy, messaging, and enforcement. There is a growing wave of eminent domain tied to energy infrastructure, turning private land into target for large-scale wind, solar, and transmission products, including XL's power pathway corridors in Colorado. My own family was forced to settle with XL for pennies on the dollar just to avoid crushing legal costs. Many states are facing similar pressure, including Maryland's Gaver Family Farm. Just in the past year, I have witnessed the Lawfare double down of governmental agency holdovers, environmental organizations, global corporations, and political adversaries from both sides. As American citizens, we are faced with a choice. Will we be freedom makers or freedom takers? And if I can only get one message across today, it is this. Private property secures the rights of the individual, it ensures distribution of power, and it guarantees resource access. So I submit to you, as long as there is beef and agriculture production on the land, we will remain free. Where there is beef, there is freedom. And with that, I thank you very much.
Yes, Ms. Byfield. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate all the members of the committee who are here to hear this. I actually want to drill down and give you a very specific example of how this is carried out and use my own family story as an illustration. One of the fundamental problems, which I'm hoping this committee will address, is that the administrative agencies embody all three powers. The separation of powers doctrine is violated in the administrative agency. They have the power to execute the law, which is their lawful authority, and they also write the law and they enforce that law. So let me tell you my story. We purchased a ranch in central Nevada in 1978, and it's a combination of private land and grazing allotments. On that land, we owned all the water rights. The ranch was 1,100 square miles. When we purchased the ranch, it was very clear from the previous owners, this is why they were getting out, that the government wanted that property. So the very first thing that happened to us is the Forest Service filed a claim over every one of our water rights and then used the grazing regulations to force us off the land. In our very first grazing season there, in a 105-day period, we received 40 certified letters and 70 personal visits from the Forest Service informing us of violations to our grazing permits. Now let me give you an example of just one. They claimed we weren't maintaining our drift fences up on Table Mountain. So Dad sent one of our employees to go fix the fence. Takes a day to ride up, a day to ride 25 miles across the top of that to check the fence, and a day to come back down. And when he finished, he handed Dad a blue tag where the Forest Service had marked our violation. And Dad asked him what was the problem, and he said there was one staple missing from that entire fence. That was our violation. We went through 13 years of that kind of harassment. We filed 3 administrative appeals after they would cancel a grazing permit or reduce a grazing permit, and we would spend 2 or 3 years fighting over that. And then we'd finish the appeal process, and the Forest Service or the BLM would say, gee, we're sorry. I guess you were right, and they'd reinstate our permits, and then they'd come back and start all over again. After 13 years of that, really the final straw was the Forest Service came in and confiscated a large amount of our cattle. They had canceled all of our permits to the point that wherever our cow was, it was going to be violating some rule or regulation. When they came in to confiscate the cattle, they brought in 25 riders, half of whom were armed with semi-automatic weapons. What they were trying to do was incite my father to come out and start a different kind of war. He let him take the cattle. That confiscation took place in 1991, and it did not come with a court order. They did not have the authorization to do it, but they knew they could get away with it. So in September of 1991, my family did something pretty unique. We filed the first federal lands grazing takings case in the history of America in the U.S. Court of Federal Claims. 4 months after we filed that case, the Forest Service filed 2 felony charges against my father, claiming that he had removed valuable timber off the federal lands. That was a whole other issue. He was cleaning out the ditch rights of way 2 years prior. They claimed he needed a special use permit, so he stopped cleaning the ditch because he knew it'd be futile to get a permit from him. So that was actually part of our takings claim, one of the ways that we alleged that they had taken our property. So 4 months after that, he went through a jury trial. We lost the jury trial, and he was under house arrest for 6 months. Fortunately, the Ninth Circuit overturned that criminal charge unanimously, if you can believe the Ninth Circuit unanimously overturned that. But at one point, we were in 3 cases. We were in the takings case, we were defending our water rights in the state court, in the state water adjudication, and then we were in the felony case. Fast forward, the claims court actually ruled with us. And chief of the claims court, Judge Lauren Smith, issued us a $14.4 million compensation award for the taking of our property. That was then appealed to the DC Circuit. The case went up to before, I think the best way to say it is 3 Eastern judges who had no concept of the complexity of federal lands. And it really was just easier to side with the federal government, so they overturned that decision. So we spent 13 years in basically hand-to-hand combat with the 3 administrative appeals, then 27 years in the federal courts, and at the end of the day, we lost the takings case, we were never compensated, and ultimately, we lost the ranch. Now, to put this in perspective, when we bought the ranch, it was when Carter was president. When a lot of the harassment took place, it was during the Reagan and Bush years. So I think one of the takeaways, if I can convey anything to you, is that sometimes it doesn't matter who we have at the top, because the bureaucracy is such a sponge that good policies dribble out to the bottom. Right now, today, the mere fact that you're holding this hearing is a game changer, because in all our time, we never had the opportunity to get before a body like this and tell our story, or even have a conversation with the Secretary of Agriculture. Today, we have a Secretary of Agriculture who is hands-on and jumps right into these cases and gets them resolved. But what's going to happen when she's not there? We have done nothing to fix the problem so that landowners are not facing this day in and day out. Our story is actually just an example of stories, thousands and thousands of stories going across America. We just had the chance to tell ours. A lot of other people didn't have the ability to fight, and they just had to go away. Thank you all.
Thank you, and I'll have a lot of questions about that, but I want to turn to our question portion now, and I want to begin with, I'm going to skip over you, Glenn, I apologize. I'm going to begin with, you're next. I'm going to yield to our great Secretary of Agriculture, G.T. Thompson from the great state of Pennsylvania.
I'm satisfied with being chairman, not secretary. Appreciate the kind thoughts, though.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate you hosting this roundtable and allowing me to participate in it. Ag lawfare happens with alarming frequency. I've seen it in my own district with my certain constituents who have really gone through their family fortunes trying to defend themselves. And that is why oversight is so important. You know, farmers and ranchers wake up every morning worrying about weather, pests, animal health, workforce, and markets, just to name a few. They should not have to wake up and worry about their government, and yet many do. Mr. Jackley, as the Attorney General for South Dakota, what do you see as the biggest gaps and misunderstandings between state government and the federal government?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, some of it boils down to communication. You know, I look as a state attorney general. I'm blessed in South Dakota where I have ongoing, I mean, I've talked to the U.S. Attorney last night on matters, but oftentimes I feel as a state attorney general, our voice isn't necessarily heard. I find that we AGs try to pick the important battles, and we communicate now more so through letters and correspondence than, you know, getting straight to the issue and having a meeting and getting it done. I think that there is, when you start talking about agricultural lawfare, many of us are concerned about some of the regulations and the attempts to regulate on glyphosate and other matters that will significantly impact the ag industry. I live in a state where we enjoy our freedom, and oftentimes when we can regulate as a state certain EPA matters rather than having the federal government do it, we feel that sometimes we can do a better job on conservation. But those are some of the issues that we attorney generals face, and it sometimes is where you see bipartisan efforts of attorneys general, where it may be an important ag issue that perhaps I and New Mexico's Attorney General agree on, but the biggest challenge is sometimes being heard. I'm chairman-elect of the National Attorney Generals Association. We oftentimes, in a bipartisan way, do letters. We make efforts to try to impact and improve what's going on in our state, especially agriculture, but sometimes we get the feeling that we're not always heard.
My observation is, obviously, in addition to just plain old government overreach, also it's many times bureaucrats that are putting emotion above science, data, and facts. And that's just unacceptable, absolutely unacceptable. Just a follow-up question for you. How can we in Congress be better allies, not only to individual states, but also to producers across the country?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think by having hearings like this to begin the conversation about what is happening and looking at what can happen better. I mean, I look at the mod situation and why I mentioned, and it wasn't just Senator Rounds, it was Congressman Dusty Johnson. They got involved, and I think that was a major turning point for the mods in agriculture. I look at, I think what Congress can do is emphasize, whether it be through the Farm Bill or other things, the importance of agriculture, the recognition that I think many farmers and ranchers just want a fair playing field. They're proud of their product, but there's oftentimes government overreach, as you mentioned, making it more challenging to produce that product. Rules that perhaps don't improve quality, they make things more unnecessarily challenging and expensive, and that's not what government should do.
And let me literally wade in on an issue that's just been reoccurring. Every pun intended. Waters of the United States has remained unclear for decades through inconsistent court rulings and changing federal regulations. EPA is working on a a new rule that will hopefully provide the much-needed certainty, and this has occurred as a result of the Sackett versus EPA case. To any of our witnesses, and thank you, by the way, for being here, how has the lack of clarity over the definition of waters in the U.S. impacted agriculture? And over the years, how has litigation and constant rulemaking affected this issue?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Waters of the United States has been very important to us agricultural attorney generals. I've been in every step of that litigation. The concern is by the federal government's attempt to redefine water in such as a way it would include every, pond, potholes on the roads. It would have made it challenging for our farmers and to a degree our ranchers to produce. And there was never in my mind any environmental justification. It was simply government overreach trying to take over waters, which, as we all know, typically the states are responsible for protecting the waters. State laws, and as an attorney general, I think feel strongly about this, generally govern in the water areas. And by the attempts that were being made to redefine waters of the United States would have been government overreach and would have shut down agriculture. And fortunately, the courts agreed with us attorneys general and would be an encouragement for Congress to not let an unelected administrative agency redefine waters of the United States, which was what was attempted.
Any other witnesses have any thoughts on waters of the U.S.?
Well, just shortly, I come from southeast Colorado, where water is very rare, probably the largest, the most important economic driver in agriculture in southeast Colorado. I come specifically from Crowley County, Colorado, where we were water rich just 50 years ago. And the attack on what I called the attack on the Charters of Freedom, or the water and land and access to that, couldn't be more exemplified than in Crowley County, Colorado, where in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the city of Denver came looking for more water, and our farmers sold their water. And what was left was a mere form of a very, we went from prosperity to desolation overnight. So in this war on beef that I talk about, it's important to understand that these natural resources taken out of the hands of the private citizen results in the depletion of your local community prosperity. And that is exactly what they were trying to do through WOTUS. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I think what I would just add to that is control of water is control of the land. So whoever controls the water is going to control that land. So it's been a very strategic device in order to actually get to the end game, which is ultimate ownership of the property. And that certainly was what happened in our case. And I think when you look at WOTUS, that's the same game, that's the same play. Whoever can control that water, and you have to understand, property is not title, and it's not who pays the taxes. That's not who owns the property. Who owns the property is whoever controls the property. And so devices like WOTUS, if they ultimately are controlling the property through its use because they can regulate it, then functionally the federal government owns that property. A conservation easement is the same concept. The land trusts control that property. They effectively own that property through that easement. I think a lot of what we're talking about is just we need to get back to a clear understanding of what property rights are, and we need to vehemently defend them. And that's really been missing. And even when we look at the takings case that my family went through, even having the courts decide what is a taking and what is property gets pretty complex. Might be something for this committee to take a look at.
Thank you. Chairman, thank you so much for hosting this really important roundtable.
Thank you, and we look forward to working with you on trying to get the Farm Bill over the finish line. Chair, now recognize Mr. Grossman from a good agriculture state, Wisconsin.
You're exactly right. And we have more dairy farms in Wisconsin and everywhere else, but, you know, we're number 3 in green beans, we're number 3 in potatoes. You always think of Idaho. Wisconsin's number 3, we're number 1 in mink, number 1 in cranberries, number 1 in ginseng, all sorts of things. And we have corn all over the state as well. I think, first of all, I'd like to thank the chairman for having a hearing here. This is such a critical issue, and if we had a decent press corps, this room would be packed with everybody hearing your stories. What it comes down to is there are people who are really socialists at heart. They think, you're right, as you said, just because you have title to your land, they feel they won a congressional election, and because I won a congressional election, it's really my land, and I can tell you what to do with it or whatnot. And it's a scary attitude, and there are way, 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 way too many people getting elected to Congress who think just because they won an election, it means that they own your land or have the right to tell you to do whatever. I'm going to come back to a statement that's here, because I always figure when we lose up here, and by when we lose, I mean the people who believe in the Constitution lose, it's because the American public does not know what's going on or does not understand the notion of freedom. I'll ask you particularly, well, I'll ask you all, starting with Ms. Byfield over there on the right, to go down and say, what do you think we can do to cause the American public to believe in freedom again, and to make sure politicians who hate freedom and who think just because they won an election that they own the land, quite frankly, have too much of a sense of self-importance. You know, we heard a gal last night just got reelected, and she went on like a 7-minute rant as to all the wonderful things she thought winning an election gave her because she got elected to Congress. What can we do to get the American public back on board on some things that I think would have been automatic to our forefathers and automatic to, quite frankly, any American 50 years ago?
And it was automatic to our forefathers. They didn't question property rights. That was so important to them. I like when we work on this all the time. We're always trying to educate the public on the importance of property rights. And particularly when you think about the founding of our nation, the one thing that makes our nation unique is we are the only nation that was established on the idea that the people would own the land. That's what distinguishes us. That is how we, the people, are able to control our government. And that's what's been evaporating. I'll tell you one thing, and you are welcome to use this if you like this, but my dad said something years ago, which was either you have the right to own property or you are property. And that really is the fundamental idea that I think we have to get across. I do like hearings like this are good to get the stories out, but I think there's also another piece of this that needs to be addressed, which is accountability. All the stories that you've heard here today, there are a lot of federal employees making these decisions, and they are unaccountable. Even when, in our case, when we were able to expose some of them and show that they were doing unlawful acts, the worst that would happen to them is that they would be transferred to another location, to another region, and become somebody else's problem. There's no accountability built into the system, and I think that's critical too. But you start actually holding these individuals accountable, that also is going to start elevating the gravity of this situation.
Thank you. But by the way, you raise a valid point. Because you have property, you actually have less freedom than somebody who doesn't. Because you can have a bureaucrat who, for whatever reason, dislikes your family or saw a quote in the paper they didn't like, and they can punish you in a way they couldn't punish somebody who's flat out broke. Right?
I couldn't say it better.
Right. There's a line I'll think of it. Mr. Sullivan?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I can remember sitting on the porch with my dad in his dying days during a terrible drought, and I looked at him and I said, "Dad, what are we going to do with this nation?" And he said, "Son, we'll never change it until everybody has to sit in the dark, cold and hungry." And that has really stayed with me throughout the last 16 years. But the key here is the exact thing that Margaret talked about. In our case, with the State Land Board and the Nature Conservancy, one disgruntled employee threatened to ruin us, and he absolutely did. And so more oversight in these state and government agencies is crucial. We have to go after these individuals who are really just ideologues and don't believe, Mr. Thompson said it right, they're socialists, they're collectivists, they don't believe in private property, they don't believe in freedom. And the reason that is because they're more than 3 generations removed from their food supply. That takes the perspective out of it, gives them a different perspective. We have to go after these people who are breaking the law in the agencies, who are overreaching their boundaries. I often liken it to the high school nerdy kid who got a little power after he came out of high school. They're power hungry, they're ideologues, and they hate liberty and freedom. And that is the interwoven diabolical mess that we've allowed to take hold in our country through all of this infiltration. And by that, I mean we're going to have to take a lot of this funding away from the NGOs. We spend millions and millions of dollars every year giving money to the NGOs. One in particular, $400 million in 2023.
Can I ask you who that is?
Thank you.
Can I ask
Yes,
you who
it's the World Wildlife Fund.
Okay. Mr. Jackley, can I let him answer my question too? Thank you, Mr. Jackley. And by the way, I again thank my chairman. If we had a competent press corps, this room would be packed with them seeing how we're losing our freedoms, but we don't. Sadly, we don't have a competent press corps. That's the first thing we need. Okay.
You know, just briefly, because I think it's been well said, I mean, our founding fathers saw the importance of private property rights when they put it in the Constitution. When you look at the public's view of this, it's important to everyone, not just a farmer and a rancher in their land, but a homeowner in a city or a tenant. They have rights too, and I think it's important to recognize and protect those rights.
Yeah, just one more quick question. Can I give it to, we'll give it to Mr. Sullivan. Or when somebody has an organization of your size, do you believe that any out-of-control bureaucrat can find some way to harass you? Is it possible to have an organization?
Absolutely, and all you have to do is go out west to see what's going on. I mean, it's just story after
Yeah,
story.
so if you pop up and say something they view as politically incorrect, they can find a way to make your life miserable because you have a big business?
It is certainly death by 1,000 cuts, and the Hages experience that. It is not unusual. In fact, it's protocol nowadays.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Lynn. Now going to recognize Mr. Palmer from Alabama.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sullivan, Ms. Byfield, General Jackie, this is to all of you. I've been very involved. I ran a think tank in Alabama. We did a little paper on how states could protect themselves from sue and settle or institutional reform litigation, as some people call it, through consent decrees, which I think are really bad arrangements. Most of these, General Jackley, if you don't know the case number or not familiar with it, you can't find it. There's no database that lists all these. And I would contend, and I'd like all of your responses, we've got an affordability issue in the country right now. How is this impacting affordability for farming and ranching?
Mr. Chairman, great question. It's significantly impacting it. You look at oftentimes when you increase government regulation, you have overreach, you increase costs. We're seeing that everywhere in agriculture, and it has a significant impact in it, whether it's glyphosate issues and other things. I mean, it affects the cost. We attorney generals fight back on many of these consent decrees and the sue and settle concept. But it definitely adversely impacts affordability.
Yeah, it is a great question, and I'd like to just point out that all of this is contention from the march to globalism. Agriculture producers are already strapped just because of overhead. But when you have to start fighting for the very land, listen, property rights doesn't have to be the land. It can be anything that helps you make a living and put food on the table. And when you have to fight for that all the time, it not only takes a financial toll, but it takes an emotional toll, a family toll, and the worry never ends. And so with the march to globalism and the attack on farmers and ranchers, or what I call the war on beef, it just continues to get worse and worse and worse. And I fear that we have gone down a road that maybe we have gone over the cliff. I do view this administration as our last chance to save liberty and freedom through property rights and our ability to produce food, not only for our communities, but for this nation and the rest of the world. Thank you.
I think I'm going to address this in just a little bit of a different perspective. The Congress has passed so many environmental laws that landowners have to comply with, from, we all know, the permitting NEPA statute. Endangered Species Act is another huge statute that impacts landowners. And that basically is the blackmail. That is what puts the regulation on the landowners and puts them in a position so that it's hard for them to produce food, hard for them to hold on to their property. That also sets up a scenario where now you need a savior to come in to bail out the landowners so we can keep feeding the American people. And so in comes all of the conservation program funding, which comes with federal nexus and federal strings that now are also tied onto that property. One of the real devilish words and practices that come out of this is mitigation. That's probably something you all are familiar with. But let me just give you one example of how this plays out. I recently read the take permit for a transmission company in Texas. And they have a take permit that was signed in 2012 that covers 12 species over 100 counties for 30 years. And when they come in and they try to build a transmission line, if they take one of those species, they have to find mitigation land in order to offset that. That mitigation can be the purchase of a conservation easement. And when they purchase that conservation easement for the purpose of conserving that species, the requirements of that permit is that they are to provide all of the funding that will be needed for the management operational expenses of that conservation easement in perpetuity for as long as that species needs to be protected. So now what have we done? First, we allow the environmental groups who use sue and settle, and sue and settle is how they pay their bills. They make a lot of money off of that. They come in, they sue to have a species listed, and then they're also on the back end, ready with a conservation easement to put on the mitigation, to be mitigation. And then they're paid to manage that forever. So there's no incentive to actually recover that species because they have a lifetime career right there that's already paid for, that industries had to pay for them to simply be on that, have that conservation easement on their land. And that's just one example. There are so many ways, like we've talked today, thousands of ways that they can do that to us. But we have to kind of back up and ask, how did we get there? It starts with these environmental laws that put these conditions on landowners and make it so difficult for them to operate. And then the environmentalists are there to certainly keep those laws in place, strengthen those laws, and then profit off of those laws.
I think what I'm really looking for, and I don't know if any of you have the capacity to produce this, I think, Ms. Byfield, you might be the one that could possibly get it done. Mr. Chairman, I think we need a as accurate as possible estimate of what this is adding to the cost of putting food on the table. I don't think the American public have a real sense of how much this is costing them just because of all these regulations, because of these lawsuits. I tell people that there's tremendous capital that's invested in farming and ranching. People really don't have an idea of how much it costs to have a combine or even a tractor for modern farming purposes. You add all of this in, and that cost shows up on the kitchen table. And if any of your groups have the ability to do some kind of estimate that you could get to us, that'd be very, very helpful. There's another issue here. It's not only regulations that are really hurting farming, and I've asked some of the farming groups to provide me with a list of regulations that you think are antiquated, or duplicative, contradictory, so that we could have a starting point. I chaired the Subcommittee on Environment and Energy and Commerce, EPA's under my jurisdiction. I've yet to get those lists. So I think the farming community's got to be a lot more forthcoming in terms of asking us to help. And this is part of what I'm asking now is give me an estimate of what this is costing people to put food on the table. People need to understand this. The other thing is not just the regulations, but the people who are fighting against efforts to mitigate against this kind of stuff. David Bernhard, former Secretary of Interior, wrote a book entitled "You Report to Me." And it's one of the best insights into what's really going on here with the administrative state, with the deep state, and how they run out the clock on an administration. Mr. Sullivan, you said you think this is the last chance. Well, you have people that are buried deep into these bureaucracies that will do everything they can to slow walk reforms or to not carry out directives or actually do something counter to the very directive. Mr. Chairman, I would highly recommend that the members of this committee read that book. We provide that book for them because it gives us insights into what our oversight role really needs to be. It's not just fighting with the lawyers that are doing these sue and settle. It's the fact that directives that we give from Congress, that the administration gives, are not being carried out.
Right.
So, but back to this whole thing, it's unaccountable power that's invested in people that you not only didn't vote for, you don't know who they are. So, with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry. Then, okay.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for y'all taking the time to travel and be here in Washington. Boy, I'm outraged at what I hear. It's unimaginable to me. I think it's unimaginable to most people that, you know, have a quarter-acre lot or something like that with a house on it, and they got to deal with what they got to deal with, ma'am. Mrs. Byfield, who owns this ranch that your family used to own? Who owns it now?
You know, I'm not entirely sure. It was bought out by some kind of a conservancy. And so I'm not even sure who owns the water. I don't think there's any grazing on it. I know that it was planned to have solar panels and that on it through the Biden administration with their wind and solar plan that they had done. But quite frankly, it's kind of heartbreaking to me, so I haven't been back in a long time.
Do you still live? It was in Nevada, right? Is that?
It's in Nevada, but I moved to Texas, which is a private land state. Nevada is 87% federally owned,
Right.
which is why we have so many of those problems, and Texas is 96% private, so it's a little better living there.
So, some, I guess the right people bought your land, and you weren't compensated for it, is that right?
Not a dime.
How does that happen? How does it even, did you have title? How does that, I understand that your ranch, at least a portion of it, was on what I would characterize from back east here as BLM land. Is that correct or not?
BLM and Forest Service.
Okay. And so was it all BLM and Forest Service leased land, or did you have a title to it, or how does that all?
No, and this really gets back to understanding how the West was settled. We owned 7,000 private deeded acres, which were basically the 640-acre homesteads that were established when that country was established. So when settlers moved into that part of the country, they thought they were going to be able to settle and own that land just like Easterners had. If you remember the Louisiana Purchase,
Sure.
530 million acres, every acre was sold off to the citizens. That's what people, when they settled the West, thought was going to happen in the West. So they go out and they establish their 640-acre homestead, but in the West, because there's so little water, You cannot make a living off of 640 acres. So, but it's incredible grazing lands. And so everything that you could graze around that land became your area that you had the right to graze. And even though the states didn't own the land, the states owned the water. So what you would do is the land that you grazed, you then would acquire that water right, first in time. And so our property was established that way, our ranch was. When the Taylor Grazing Act came in about 1936, that's when the government came in and started settling up who had the right to certain areas of the territory out there. So was it the rancher that had the private deeded land and had been grazing it all this time and owned the water on the federal lands? He would get like a Class A permit. A sheep herder who would just kind of travel through seasonally would get Class C permit. But that's how this was all established. And so ranchers in the West, when it was settled, were under the understanding that it wasn't a grazing lease. They owned that right to graze. They owned the feed. Even though the federal government still retained the land, they owned the water, and they owned the right to graze. And nobody else could come in and graze over the top of them. They had that right. That was a defensible right. So that was established in the 1800s. Now fast forward a good 100+ years of environmental regulations, and that has all been watered down into getting people to believe that it's simply a lease and it can be taken at any time. That really was the conflict when we filed our takings case that we wanted to settle. Mom and Dad said, okay, we've got to figure out what do we own and what don't we own out here. And so we know what we're fighting over. And so we made that takings claim that we owned that grazing right, that we owned the water, that we owned the range improvements, that we owned the base property. And the claims court agreed with us, said that we owned the water that flowed off the federal lands to our private deeded lands. We owned all of that. The court even said we owned the ditch rights-of-way that my dad was criminalized over cleaning out, and owned 50 feet on either side of those, even across the federal lands, and that we owned all the range improvements and, of course, our private property in that. And that's what the claims court had determined. So it's kind of complex in the West because it's such a mixed bag of who owns what out there. And it's only become more complicated with these environmental regulations.
So, I'm from out east, and we don't pretend to know what's right for you folks out there. But it seems to me, especially if this is federally owned land, either through BLM or through the Forest Service, once you buy/lease it, whatever, if it's an acre of land or thousands of acres of land, the water, the mineral, that's all part of the deal. You either take that or you don't take that, and you know what the provisions are up front. Who would ever be engaged in any of this if they thought for a minute that that could be taken away at the drop of a hat, right? And I certainly think I understand your perspective about the different organizations and the regulations and laws that have been put into place essentially to deprive you. That's what they're all, we know what that's what they're used for. It all sounds great when you're here in Washington, D.C., down on the House floor, and you got to vote on some endangered species that you want to protect it, or your constituents think you're mean or something like that. But we know there's a nefarious intent to that. But I don't think most people connect the dots about what actually happens. I remember, it's been a few years, obviously, but there was this dispute, and I can't even remember the guy's name. But I mean, they were almost going to war over this BLM land and grazing rights. I mean, they had a small army out there, and the federal government backed down. I'm sure you know the case I'm talking about. I don't remember the gentleman's name, but we don't want our country run like that, and we don't want our citizens put in that circumstance. And so I guess my question for all of you, and maybe you'd be the best one to answer this, because I imagine Mr. Sullivan, like rightly so, and certainly Mrs. Byfield, are personally passionate about this, and they might have the wrong idea, which would be understandable. Well, what kind of accountability would each of you envision for the bureaucrats that are happy to engage in, you're missing a staple on a fence? And how many acres did you say? What did you say?
Oh, the fence was 25 miles long.
That's unimaginable to people from the east. We don't see anything that's 25 miles long, you know. I mean, our roads are all curvy and, you know, it's old country here and it's owned by hundreds and thousands of people over time. We just don't see things like that. But what does accountability look like? What would be right and righteous?
From my perspective, I come from a state where we balance our budget. We have an appropriation process. If you're part of the state government and you act inappropriately, your budget is affected. That's an effective way of accountability. I feel another potential way of accountability, and it's been discussed here today, is what does all this cost? What is the cost to this, and publish it and have people have to respond to that? When you start hearing about some of the criminal cases, whether it be the mods or what's been testified here today, I mean, I think accountability has to come from the top. And I feel that if the top isn't listening, there's a budget process, just like we do in South Dakota, that if I, as Attorney General, acted inappropriately, I know what would happen. I would be called into the appropriators, and I'd have to answer for what I'm doing. And I think that's the best way of accountability. And then, of course, from the public, accountability is at the ballot box. If they feel that things aren't happening appropriately or going the right way, they have the power to speak through the ballot box.
I hear you, sir, and that last one is troublesome for me. I don't know what the population of the county that your ranch was located in is, but I suspect that would be easily outvoted for the sake of accountability by the rest of the state, much less the rest of the country, right? So, unfortunately, that's it's an imperfect accountability. I hear what you're saying, sir, but that's not going to help Mrs. Byfield and her family and recoup their investment by some bureaucrat that's not elected anyhow. So the budget does help, but I think you got to look. I personally think that, and I appreciate your indulgence, Mr. Chairman. The people that knew that they were wandering around looking for one missing staple on a fence post and 25 miles of staples and fence posts, that individual or those individuals have names. They did this by design for a reason. They got an axe to grind, they got a political bent, they got an ideology, a philosophy, and they're imposing it on you with the awesome, irresistible power of the state. I say the state, the government. There's not a damn thing you can do about it, and that comes with a higher level of accountability and responsibility in those individuals. What also comes with, to me, the risk of being held accountable, and to me it seems to me your rights have been taken away from you, and those are civil rights violations, and they should come with the penalties commensurate with that. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield the balance.
Thank you. I'll recognize next Mr. Gosar from Arizona, and after him will be Chairman Burchett from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. AG Jackley, you brought up a good point, following the money. Okay, so a lot of these NGOs are funded, and yet we can't get a report that actually shows us where they get their funding. I actually was building a bill that actually said, if you got one penny, either directly from the federal government or indirectly through a pass-through, you had to show us where you got all your money, because that will limit a lot of it. So I agree with you. And I go back to this Luis Brandeis' comment. He said, in the government of laws, the government will be imperiled if it doesn't scrupulously adhere to the law, no matter how large or small. If the government breaks the law and invites everybody to break the law, it creates anarchy. Here we have anarchy, exactly what all three of you are talking about. Would you agree that you start by following the money, and would a transparency bill like that work?
Absolutely.
Do you think outside money, like for foreign countries, should be involved in those NGOs?
No.
Thank you. Mr. Sullivan, the Mexican wolf continues to terrorize American ranchers in Arizona and New Mexico. But the latest threat to these ranchers are the environmental NGOs that I was just talking about, that oppose common sense species in management. These ranchers are harassed, their tires are slashed, and their properties are vandalized, all for simply speaking up against an apex predator dropped in their backyards. Many people fail to recognize that these ranchers are small business owners too. if small business owners' storefronts in town are vandalized by eco-terrorists, there are criminal investigations and resources to rebuild the lost profit. But our ranchers are left without resources to defend themselves for simply protecting their domestic food supply. So thank you for RCAF, USA, for endorsing my bill, the Enhancing Safety for Americans for Animals Act. Now, how have environmental NGOs weaponized the judicial system against ranchers and small agricultural business owners?
Well, we've already discussed that, and you said it exactly right. They do it by the money, right? They get global corporations to partner up with them, and then they follow through pulling that money down. One of our problems here, and I know it was a bill that I have a real problem with, is the Sustains Act. These public-private partnerships are very, very dangerous. And though they can work on a local level for the positive, the NGOs and the bureaucrats know how they can use these public-private partnerships to end all production and get control of the land and water. That's what they do. And then with all of this funding that we're just throwing at the NGOs, they're passing that down to other organizations. Save the Bull Trout in Montana is one of them, has no money, but they're getting money to sue the West Side Ditch Company over water rights. Where are they getting the money from? They're getting the money from pass-throughs. So we have to try to stop this flow of money and funding to these NGOs. I think that's the first thing that we have to do. Accountability comes next. We have to keep them accountable on the bureaucratic level. We're never gonna change the ideologies of these collectivists. That's not gonna happen. So we have to take the funding from them and mitigate these processes that they're abusing. And it's our money, it's all of our money, conservative, liberal, whatever it is, that's getting abused. So we have to start with the money.
Yeah, so I absolutely agree with you on that one. And so much of it is, they say we want term limits for lawmakers. I think we ought to have term limits for staff. Because an inbred staff here in Washington, D.C., and it's inbred. I'll tell you that right now. What if I told you, Mr. Sullivan, that the IRS already does what we're just asking? That they look at the money. But when you order a report, it's completely blacked out. Not redacted, it's totally blacked out. Would that surprise you?
No, it's not. At RCAF USA, we asked for a report on a checkoff initiative and got 137 pages of redacted material. None of that surprises me at all.
It's absolute lunacy. Mrs. Byfield, it's always a pleasure to see you here. And many environmental NGO judicial activists would like to see all public and private lands locked up for use. That means no domestic food supply, no building materials, no domestic dominance. Luckily, the multiple use doctrine protects the use of these lands. Would tying agricultural lands to a vulnerable asset like Social Security disincentivize judicial activism from any NGOs and eco-terrorists?
Yes, I think if we could tie the productivity of the federal lands to the Social Security Fund, that would be a very good way to incentivize them.
What would we lose if this lawfare is left unchecked?
We're going to lose a lot. We're going to lose our right to private property. We already are losing the ownership of the land. Let me tell you one other part of our story that might be helpful here. You know, when we were in the middle of our takings case, Dad was contacted by a big mining company. They wanted to buy our ranch. So here we have a ranch with a huge takings case on it, where a cow is illegal to graze anywhere. We have a mining company coming to us saying, hey, we want to buy your ranch. So he sat down with him and he asked him, well, why do you want to buy a ranch? And they said, well, we need to get a federal permit to open up our mine. The federal government gave us a list of properties that if we could acquire them, buy them, or conserve them in some way, and then turn that over to the federal government, they would get their permit to open their mine. That was mitigation. Everything, I think, if you take everything that the three of us have said here today, the theme of all of this is the federal government and the environmentalists want complete control of the land in this nation. Whoever controls the resources controls the nation. It's about power, it's about money. It has nothing to do with stewardship, proper stewardship of the land. So I don't know if that addresses your question, but that's really the big picture. That's the big game here. And we have to stand in the way of that. We have to defend the property rights, and it starts at the ground level by defending landowners and families like what my family, those who are going through this today, standing in and defending them. And accountability of the people, of the personnel on the ground floor, is essential to stopping the lawfare.
So my bill, the Lasso Act, takes 10% of all the revenues activities on public lands and waters and deposits them in the Social Security Trust Fund. It gives all the Americans the ability to fight these eco-terrorists. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And what I love about that is the environmentalists are going to be the last one who really kind of agree with that because they have an agenda. But what it does is the rest of America gets to participate in the productivity of our federal lands and benefit from that. And so from my perspective, it's a great bill, and it would be very helpful if that was to go through.
So one last question, with your indulgence. So you brought up multiple use doctrine and Taylor Grazing Act. These are two great things for my vantage point. How does that work? You know, so like if my bill was to go and be passed, right now it would be $2 to $4 billion. But what we're inherently giving to people is the ability to govern that land directly at their benefit. So if they did the multiple use doctrine, there'd be a lot more money. So that could generate, you easily see go from $4 billion to $70 billion a year, because they have to take care of the stewardship, like you said, and the maintenance of those lands. Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, during the Obama years, the BLM had on their website that since the passage of the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, which came after the Taylor Grazing Act, they had successfully reduced grazing on the federal lands by 50%. That was the Obama years. It went down considerably during the Biden years, and unfortunately did not go up much, has not gone up much since then, which I know the USDA is working on getting those numbers back up. But losing 50% of the productivity, the grazing productivity off those lands is a huge hit to not only the landowners who are out there trying to make a living, but the local economies that survive on that, and then our national economy. So if we had something like the Lasso Act that prioritized productivity off of these lands, it would be a game changer.
Last question, Mr. Sullivan. One of the things I've always looked at is always go back at an agency for our wrongdoings. I'll give you an example. So endangered species. There were no buffalo on the Grand Canyon at any time, were there?
No.
No. So then we have the Department of Ag going in with the BLM, and they decide that they're going to try this breeding bison with cattle. And then what they do is they turn them loose. Well, what happened? Well, they all started migrating to the Grand Canyon. So I call them beefaloes. Okay, pretty good eating, you know. But I said we need to get rid of them because they don't suffice. There's endangered species they're taking out. They're taking their environment away. So we need to play this back at them. So what their proposal was that they were going to bring in all these government sharpshooters and then just lay them to death. I thought, that's great. You see one of the 7 wonders of the world, and that smell, you can't get rid of that smell. Well, I then went back to him and said, listen, why not use this with the state? Allow the state to cull this herd. Give them a chance to take a beefalo. It's a one-time only deal type thing. To this day, there's only a couple of those tags ever been given. So we have to hold the bureaucrats themselves accountable, don't you agree?
Oh, absolutely. And that isn't just, it's all over the nation.
I thank you, Chairman, for your indulgence. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, I have one last thing, sorry. I'd like for submission to the record, 2 articles. To enter into the record from the Gila Herald, detailing an eco-terrorist attack in Greenlee County, the Arizona County, on the front lines of the Mexican.
Without objection, so ordered. Thank you. Chair now recognizes Chairman Burchett from Knoxville, Tennessee.
Say that with disrespect in your voice, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Let me ask y'all something. I was sitting here thinking, where the heck's the dadgum Farm Bureau on this stuff? You know, I'm sick. People back home are sick of people writing tough letters and acting tough. Where the heck are they? Everybody's all wrapped up in the farm bill. Ma'am?
Okay, start with me. Well, we're a property rights organization, and they have never been with us on any of the fights.
You've answered my question. Go ahead, sir. And that is an incredible hat. I have a farm, 60 acres. You'd probably call it a drain field. Got a few horses, a couple donkeys, and I don't know how many barn cats I got, and I have yet to get a cool hat. And I've got a Massey Ferguson tractor. You'd think my wife and daughter would take a little pride in that. But anyway,
I'm
go
not
ahead.
interested in the
You got enough
tractor,
there
but
for
I'll help
both
you
of
with the
us, I
hat.
think.
I can certainly help you with the hat. Yeah. Totally. What was the repeat the question?
Where the heck is the dadgum
Yeah,
Farm
the
Bureau?
Farm Bureau. Well, earlier in my testimony, I relayed the fact that these national trade organizations have been bought and paid for by the global corporate cabal, what I call the cabal, and they have to abide by where the money comes from. And so that's what we're seeing with these trade organizations leading the nation. We have a lot of land issues in the West. One that I'm thinking off the top of my head, and everybody is saying, where is the Farm Bureau? Where is PLC? And it seems like sometimes it just depends on if you are a member of their organization or maybe a member of no organization of who gets help. And I've witnessed that personally just this week.
Sir?
Mr. Chairman, I have a farm and a ranch, and this is important, and so we need them to engage. So when I get back home, they're going to get a phone call from their Attorney General.
All right. Mr. Sullivan, in your view, which level of government, federal, state, or local, presents the most immediate threat to independent producers today? What do you think Congress can do? You know, these hearings are great, but what the heck can we do?
Yeah, you have to take the money from them. The problem right now, let's take, for instance, in Washington State with the King case. I'm working on it very closely, working with the family and their lawyers right now, and USDA as well. We have to take their money because, for example, the Department of Ecology, which is pushing this case, is funded 1/3 by the federal government. And so we have to decide who's going to be in control here. Is states' rights versus federal authority? But ultimately, it comes down to the money. That's where it's got to start.
All right. Mr. Attorney General, what changes to the federal agency practices or due process protections would prevent small family farms from being targeted by frivolous lawsuits?
It's a great question. I mean, I think it comes down to accountability, and transparency. I mean, I think when you hear of these stories that have been testified to today, somebody should be held accountable, and it should be transparent.
All right. And before I forget, when y'all get an idea for some legislation, something really tough, I would love to get a hold of that. I would love to just call my dadgum office and let's get on it. I'm sick of this. This makes me sick to my stomach. And this is for everybody. How can Congress rein in the state actors using legal interpretations to attack farmers? Ma'am, if I could get you first, and thank y'all so much for being here.
Our pleasure. How can they rein in? Well, one of the first things that I think we need to focus on is the lack of local control. The federal government has come in and everything is top down, and local communities, including the sheriffs, feel like they're strapped a little bit because these federal agencies come in, even land management agencies that are not trained for the purpose of law enforcement are the ones coming in and enforcing these laws. So for instance, in our story, one of the other things that happened, at one point my dad was shot at twice, and he ducked behind his truck. They got his truck twice. The only vehicle he could see in the entire valley was a Green Forest Service truck, which is where the shots were coming from. And that was just a signal to say, hey, we can take you out anytime. That's what that meant. And there was another time where Mom and all of us kids were in the car. She was driving us to Tonopah, the town. The district ranger literally ran us off the road. And I remember going into the ditch with my mom and all the kids, all of us kids in there. And he just kept on going once he ran us in the ditch. So our recourse for that was we had to appeal to the Forest Service and ask them to investigate themselves. So they came out, they investigated themselves, they decided they did no wrong, But they did transfer one guy, so he became somebody else's problem. Again, no accountability.
Right.
That should have been something that the local sheriff should have been investigating. And there's a real problem there where the federal agencies come in and they kind of intimidate the sheriffs. Unless the sheriffs really understand their authority, they intimidate them. And they tell them, we're the government, you have to stand down, we'll take care of this. When they came in and confiscated our cattle, the sheriff there at the time, he really didn't realize what was going on, and he wasn't there to protect us. But after they confiscated the cattle, he told Dad, he apologized, and he said, I should have been there, I shouldn't have let them do it. And then he deputized my dad to make sure he was always in a position to defend himself, and that was his signal to say that our department is standing behind you. But we have to take the control away at the federal level and empower the local governments who know the people, who know what's going on the ground, to be able to step in and help defend the citizens in these situations.
I would agree with Margaret on that level. However, there is a case, coming out of Colorado right now where the state legislature has passed out a committee a bill that would take all local control away from our county commissioners in determining property rights. So I do feel like that there needs to be some government or some federal oversight on the sovereignty on those issues. I think we're getting everything really mixed up. I think we're getting confused on the authorities and the timeline of their authority. So we really do need Congress to act and make sure that these constitutional rights are not being impeded on a state level and local level. That's kind of what we're seeing in the King case in Washington, where the constitutional right for the Kings to a jury trial is being impeded on the state level. And I feel like that is a federal, that needs to have a federal response.
Right. Sir?
I think doing exactly what you're doing here today, having oversight, transparency, if an issue is seen, bringing it to light helps. And then I think on accountability, it goes back to Congress has the power of the purse and has an ability to make change through the appropriation and financial process.
I can assure you, if we didn't have a chairman with some guts, not talking about myself, but our chairman, this wouldn't be going on. I've got to go, and I've got a million more questions. I want to make a statement. I have legislation dealing with these meat processors. They're foreign controlled, and I can't even get I don't know. You'd think I'm not even on the ag committee, all right? And I have a farm. Like I say, it's 60 acres. It's not a farm. I get it, but it's I can't get a call back on it. You'd think Farm Bureau and the rest of these outfits would say, hey, enough is enough. And I think we need to continue to expose it. Call them out. The King has no deadgum clothes. That's a perfect example. They control the meat processing. They control commodity. And we're not putting a stop to it. And the Chinese have their talons in it. And and then when they pass some stupid regulation at our local level, I mean, we have this one processing plant I was told was in my area was closed down, or they were threatened to fine them because they didn't have a woman's bathroom in there. It was just a bathroom, it wasn't designated. And they said, show me in the regulations where that is. It's not even in the dadgum regulations. And again, what'd you call it, the cabal or whatever? Yeah, it's very evident to me. And we got to start calling it out, and I'm sick of it. I'm sick of big ag. I'm sick of all of it. And they're not protecting Americans. They're protecting international stockholders, and that to me is a very chilling
Absolutely.
effect on an industry. And we talk about this morning. I heard everybody talking about we're going to protect farmers with all this stuff, and no, we're not. We're going to protect the stockholders.
Yeah, and that's
small farmers are out.
That's a really good point to make. I think on this march to globalism, we have got, we have the laws. We have the laws on books, the antitrust laws, Sherman antitrust, Clayton antitrust, packers and stockyards. These need to be enforced and break those big packers up. The reason we're at a 50 or a 70-year low since 1951 on cattle numbers in the United States. the grocery store prices are skyrocketing. That's because there are not enough, and that has been a result of globalism. We have to end these partnerships.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry I
Thank
went
you.
over and I was bragging on you and your,
I
your fair
appreciate it.
state yesterday.
I've learned you're a sought-after speaker in Kentucky, so that's a big deal.
Apparently, they value good looks and intelligence more than Congress does.
All right, I'm going to recognize Mr. Burleson next, then Mr. Crane. Mr. Burleson from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for coming. Missouri, in my district, I have probably 10,000 family farms in my district, mostly cattle. Poultry is becoming a bigger issue. We're the home of Vital Farms. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's people that have got money that go to Whole Foods buy these free-range chicken eggs. I've seen it firsthand, and they are free-range. But look, whenever I talk to cattlemen, they're always concerned about the regulations. They're concerned about getting sued. And this is all compounding in a problem that they're facing when it comes to increased costs of fertilizer or feed, you name it. All of the material costs are going through the roof, and then they have to worry about the fact that they've got a bureaucrat that's got an axe to grind on them. And so, first, I mean, just an open question, how has the posture changed since Trump has come into office? And I'll let each of you respond to that.
I can start. I would say it's been very positive. It's been positive in a sense that, I mean, if you look back at the Mod case in South Dakota, what the administration did in that case, I think that's a living example of where they put farmers and ranchers first. They recognize the importance of private property rights. I think that if you look at the administration, there's a genuine effort through Burke Rollins to try to sort out areas of overregulation, unnecessary regulation that at the end of the day affects affordability. And I think it's been a positive sense for the farmers and ranchers of our nation.
Yeah, I'll agree with that. Rural America is overwhelmingly conservative, and of course there are going to be those blue dog Democrats that are never going to see it our way. But what President Trump and his administration has done is bring back hope. And that is hope into the Charters of Freedom, our foundation, to get us back to where we came from that ultimately led to where we are today. And that liberty and freedom brought to us by our ability to own private property is exactly the hope that we all have on the land. That's the only thing that matters. This whole hearing is about the land and the access to the resources. That's what we're talking about, because that is the last thing that keeps this nation going. And like I said, once we're off the land, everybody loses their freedom. So President Trump and this administration, along with Secretary Rollins, especially for agriculture, has been a breath of fresh air. We love it. We're excited about it. And farmers and ranchers are not immune to adversity. They're used to it, right? So we will go through a little bit of pain to right the ship that was wronged over the last 3 decades, to be honest. So we're excited about it.
And I'm going to totally agree with that. What was really strange for me to think about is after all those years where we were in the Takens case for 27 years, the Takens case against the Forest Service, to then have the chief of the Forest Service under Secretary Rollins call me and, want to help sort out some of these lawfare issues with some of our members. I mean, it's like, does he know I'm a Hage, right? Because, Hages and Forest Service don't really get along very well. Absolute game changer with this administration. And I think what I'm most concerned about is that right now we're seeing a lot of changes, but what happens when she's not sitting in that seat? She has a personal interest taking care of these. Right. And I think the money is a big part of that, cutting off the money. And I think the DOGE work is incredible. And that, to me, is one of the things that Congress is doing right now that I think has some of the best legs for actually cutting this off for future administrations. And we will help you identify funds if you need help in that area with that.
We could always use some help. I'll say in my state, we had a big fight whenever I was a state senator. In Missouri, we had an energy company that was putting solar fields in Kansas and Nebraska, and then they wanted to run a transmission line all the way across northern Missouri from one end to the other, across farmers' properties using eminent domain to take their property. And you have generational family farms that suddenly have a 300-foot tower. These things are not tiny. This is not a telephone pole line. These are huge, massive structures just right across your family farm. Now that's your skyline, right? And it doesn't even serve the interest of the people. And this is kind of this is like a downstream impact of the kind of crazy environmental things that we were going through to try to get to having a zero carbon footprint, right? Well, I mean, and saying, oh, we care about the environment, but we care enough that we're going to throw these massive structures across our beautiful farmlands to do that. It's because they don't really care. They didn't care about the farmers. They don't care about. They just care about their weird ideology of trying to get electricity in some kind of carbon neutral way. But that's a downstream impact. That having to fight that tooth and nail. I fought that in Missouri and got that practice banned. But that was a very, very difficult fight. Up here, one of the things that we've learned is that you've got bureaucrats that are not even, I mean, these people are clearly not elected, but they're not even in an appointed position. They're all the way at the bottom, and then they write some guidance document, and it becomes administered like it's law. And the reason it's administered like law is because you guys could get sued if you're not following the guidance document. And so that's why the chairman has been supportive of this. I have a bill that's called the Guidance Clarity Act that makes it very clear that if a person is doing a guidance document, that it has no force and effect of law. It is simply a one bureaucrat's opinion, has nothing that won't hold up in court. Can you guys talk to the impact of something like that and how that might impact you all?
Absolutely. We fought that in our case, where they would cite their handbook as like it was legal doctrine, and even we had in our case where I think it was the chief of the claims court wrote in one of the opinions that said a handbook is not law, and had to make that pretty clear. Absolutely, that will be helpful. That is one of the ways that they really they go around Congress. So Congress writes the laws, they will write the regulations, but then they write policies, and it's actually the policies that they will follow. They don't follow the law, and they don't follow the regulations. We, at American Stewards, we do a lot of coordination work where we will bring the federal agencies to the table to coordinate with the local governments, and we help the local governments do this. And I can't tell you how many times we've sat across the table from the line officers who will dictate to us out of their handbook that they can do X, Y, and Z because their handbook says it, and we point out to them, but that's not a law, and you can't do that. And it's like, on the ground, they're baffled by that because they've been taught that handbook is more important than the regulations and the actual law that Congress passes. This gets back to what I said in the very beginning, which is these administrative agencies have all three powers. There's no separation of power. They execute the law, which they are legally obligated to do, but then they write the law through the regulations and the policies, and then they get to judge it. And like in our case, I mean, we had to go through the administrative appeals process. And if we went through one of those administrative appeals and they said, no, we still think we were right, then we could actually get into federal district court. But that was after 2 or 3 years of being in the administrative appeals process. And then the only record that the federal court would be able to review was that record that was built during the administrative process, which the Forest Service controlled. So you just have the debt completely stacked against you. So I think that's probably one of the larger issues is how do we break up the three powers being combined in these administrative agencies, and I like the idea of starting with those handbooks, those guidance policies.
Yeah, I agree. This is a result of unaccountability and oversight by Congress. For example, in the mod case in South Dakota, there was a lower level Forest Service agent, Special Agent Travis Lunders, who decided himself that the fence line was off by less than 5 feet, right? And so he decided that they would prosecute. He was the decision maker in that prosecution, and that overreaching authority that he thought he had, could have cost the mods their whole livelihood and their family. 10 years in prison, $250,000 in fines. And so it's not an isolated case. These people have to be brought to accountability. What I understand is there's some sort of union that keeps us from firing these people within these government agencies. That needs to go away. If they're not doing their job, if they're overreaching and causing mass confusion and all of these lawfare issues, that needs to be rectified.
I would just further add, when the Chevron case was reversed, when it applied to agency decisions, from a state's perspective, that was a game changer. I think that decision, as time goes on, we'll see more fair decisions and better decisions. I know early in your question you mentioned the eminent domain concept, and I've been involved in eminent domain litigation pretty much my whole legal career. And when you look at the federal system versus the state system, I think there's some lessons learned. In South Dakota, when you have eminent domain, you are entitled to just compensation, but it's a jury that decides that. On the federal side, you don't get a jury of your peers. You get a judge. Judges make good decisions every day, but sometimes I think in the American system, the jury is important. So as you look at potential opportunities, we have a state structure that not only do we get a jury for fairness, that if the government behaves badly and didn't give you an offer for your property of a certain amount and the jury comes back a certain percentage more, the government has to pay your attorney fees. And so there are built-in protections under state law that don't necessarily exist under federal law, and I think it's something that can be learned by that. But I mean, overall, going back to the administrative agencies, Chevron was a huge decision for protecting against some of the federal overreach and what had been occurring in certain agencies in the federal government.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Thank you, Mr.
Very good. Thank you. Chair now recognizes Mr. Crane from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to say thank you to the panelists for coming today. Congress is pretty backwards. We have been sending millions of taxpayer dollars overseas with little accountability, even as concerns grow about where that money ultimately ends up. While here at home we allow our laws to be weaponized against American citizens, the Equal Access to Justice Act, passed in 1980, expanded the federal government's liability to pay attorney's fees for those who prevail against it. But unlike individuals and small businesses, nonprofit organizations face no financial eligibility limits. This creates a system where well-funded environmental groups can repeatedly sue federal agencies and have their legal fees reimbursed by taxpayers. In fiscal year 24, the Equal Access to Justice Act spent approximately $120 million in legal reimbursements in places like Tonto National Forest. Groups such as the Center for Biological Diversity have filed lawsuits targeting grazing and land management, delaying projects and increasing costs. When taxpayer dollars are funding both the lawsuits and the defense, while forest management is stalled and rural livelihoods are impacted, it is clear the system is not working as intended. And I was looking at the Equal Access to Justice Act. If I'm not mistaken, it applies to an individual with a net worth of $2 million or less, or the owner of a business or other organization worth $7 million or less, and with no more than 500 employees. Whereas you have nonprofits like the Center for Biological Diversity, and as of 2024, its total assets were almost $60 million, annual revenue of $45.7 million, and has anywhere between 201 and 500 employees. Do you guys see this as a massive problem? Because I hear from ranchers in my district all the time that They constantly live under lawfare. I'm going to start with you, Ms. Byfield.
Yeah, absolutely. That equal access to justice is how they pay their bills. So they sue. When they get a favorable administration, they settle. They get their attorney's fees paid for, and then that gives them the money to come out and do it again. So Center for Biological Diversity in particular, I mean, a lot of what they do is they sue for protection of endangered species. And one of the things that I'd mentioned earlier is that they get the money two ways. Through the sue and settle, equal access to justice, they get funded that way. But then they get funded on the back end too, because through the mitigation process, which is necessary to protect the species and restrict the land, they also get paid through that, through the conservation easements, where corporations have to pay that land trust for the management operation fees that it will incur to manage that through the life of the protection of that species or in perpetuity. So if they can get the species listed, they get money through sue and settle. And then if they can keep it on the list and ensure it's never recovered, they get paid to infinity. And all of that is baked in through the federal laws. The federal laws are the start of all of that. And so that's where, if we can start figuring out some ways to cut off that money, that would be very helpful.
Well, it seems as if that Equal Access to Justice Act was targeted for the little guy, right? Mm-hmm. And that's why these clarifications were made, $2 million for an individual and then $7 million or less for a company. But yet nonprofits, there was really no, number put in there. And it just doesn't seem fair, does it?
No, not at all.
Do you think that we should amend the Equal Access to Justice Act to put
Yes.
some requirements on nonprofits?
Absolutely.
Mr. Sullivan or Mr. Jackley, do you guys have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I'll add a little bit on that. And not only is that everything she said is correct, but what they're doing is they're using that ability to raise funds to actually become competition with landowners. So they're buying a lot of land, and some of the ENGOs, environmental non-governmental organizations, through these public-private partnerships, are actually buying the land and then handing them over to government agencies, where then the government takes it off the tax roll, and it further hollows out these local rural communities. I mean, there's Southeast Colorado. There are counties that their courthouses are only open 3 days a week. They've lost so much land, taken off the land off of the tax base, that they cannot keep the things open. And it's competition. We wonder why there's 700,000 less producers on the land today. That's part of the reason. We can't compete with that money.
Mr. Jackley.
I would agree. When you look from an AG's perspective, the sue and settle and that being at times a form of policy making is not an appropriate use of the court system. I think there should be a level of accountability and transparency for it. I think it does make sense to look at some of the equal access to justice rules.
I'm going to ask this, and anyone can answer it. How have repeated lawsuits from environmental groups affected the ability of the Forest Service to carry out basic forest management and grazing permits? Ms. Byfield, you want to take that one?
Yeah, they've been very successful at stopping forest sales, timber sales, and using the NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, they've been able to stop a lot of these forest sales, which then have led us to tremendous wildfires, because we can't thin our forests, and most of those have been done through the courts. I think if we didn't have the environmental interference, our forests would be in much better shape today.
And then on the back end of these wildfires, which I've seen a lot in my own district in rural Arizona, you also have massive flooding that often comes because there's no trees, foliage, bushes to hold back or soak up any of this rain, and it floods right down into many of these floodplains, which often happen to be small towns. We have Globe in Miami in my district right now that just got hammered by flooding right, a couple years after a massive fire up on the hills. And so it just devastates a lot of these communities. And the wildfires are obviously horrific, but they're often the first part and often don't get associated, with the floods that come afterwards. The Equal Access to Justice Act was intended to help individuals challenge the government not to fund an industry of litigation. Do you believe that the EAGA is being abused by well-funded nonprofit organizations to finance serial lawsuits against land use projects? Mr. Sullivan?
Absolutely. There's an example of that, the West Side Ditch Company in Montana right now being sued by the Save the Bull Trout Environmental Organization, who also partners with Western Watersheds and about 50 other organizations to pay for their stuff. They are absolutely using it at this moment.
Mr. Jackley, do you know of any other cases that you've seen?
Yeah, thank you. The AG community has seen several. We've made position statements on this, and so this is a growing problem, and I would encourage it being looked at.
We talked about some of these issues in relation to ranchers and how many cattle they're allowed to run on their land. Can you talk about the impacts to the ranchers and also the economy that go along with this? I'll let anybody who wants to take it.
Yeah, when you take the production off the land, it literally drives out the local community. The thing about the ranching community, it's different than like recreation or any of the other inputs that come into that county. The rancher lives there, and every dollar turns over. But one of the functionalities of a ranch operation is you never can go too far from home. I mean, it's actually, the only reason Shad can be here is because he's got people on the place who can watch the place. But if you're just a small operation and it's you and your wife and maybe a couple kids, you don't go too far from home, which means you're always going to be buying your groceries in the county, you're going to be buying your gas in the county, you're going to be buying your cars in the county, and all of that money stays in that local community because you've got to go home and feed cows every night. And so you have that, but the other infrastructure so you have the economic infrastructure that comes from the agriculture groups, the agriculture production, but the other infrastructure that people miss is the human infrastructure. It's all those ranchers and farmers that sit on the school boards, volunteer for those, the fire district, the county commissioners, the school districts, the hospital boards. They are the human infrastructure that keeps that community going. So when you start taking the cattle off the land or farming out of the community, you will see these communities dry up in more ways than one, not just financially, but in human resources.
Does it also hurt with wildfires as well as if you get these grasses on the ground that aren't being grazed and get a little too high? Mr. Sullivan?
Absolutely, it's all interwoven. And to piggyback off on her comments, my local community, we've lost so many students in our schools, especially in far southeast Colorado, that there's 3 schools coming together to make up one football team that has to drive 250 miles to play. So these are real, true life examples of how rural America is dying up. We need more people on the land. We need more production on the land. And to your point, yes, the wildfires, same thing.
I would just add that, certainly the family farms across rural America have challenges. They are decreasing in numbers, which affects every community. And overall, I think it affects overall production, which is affordability at the grocery store. And I think that's why this is such an important topic. When I come from South Dakota, we have the beautiful Black Hills, where Mount Rushmore is located. And when you talk about the logging side of it, we've seen how these lawsuits and how these regulations have shut down our mills. They've increased fire safety issues. They've affected the environment adversely. And so it's created real challenges in our state.
Thank you. What specific statutory changes would help prevent abuse of the legal system while still allowing legitimate environmental concerns to be heard? Anybody?
One thing that I would add, and I know we talked about a little bit earlier, is legislation that goes towards transparency. There are at times lawsuits that are filed, and we don't have any idea who's funding them, what the basis is, and that would be important. So I would urge you that on some of these national type matters where there's independent third-party funding happening, I think people should know about it. I think certainly the litigants should know about it because there may be conflicts and other things that are important for a jury to hear or a judge to hear, and I would encourage that consideration.
Do you guys think we should defund the reimbursement for the environmental lawsuits from this fund?
Yes.
Mr. Sullivan?
Absolutely.
Mr. Jackley?
Yes, and I think it needs to be looked at.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. I have questions, but I'm going to yield to Mr. Gosar to ask a few follow-up questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Attorney General, you brought up the loser pays aspect. How do you think that could be utilized in using jury trials? How do you think that would affect this aspect?
One thing it's important to recognize that we have an open court system, that we want to encourage people, whether it be the mods or others that are having a dispute, to be able to go in and not make it financially impossible. But you also need to take a look at, as there are attempts to sue and settle inappropriately changing policy, I think there needs to be provisions put in there to address that so that we don't want to infect our open courts. The ability for somebody with not a large amount of means that's been wronged to be able to go to court and get a resolution and be treated fairly. But I think as things have happened, as we have seen in our court system, them perhaps being abused, I think you address that by number one, transparency. If there's funding of certain lawsuits, it ought to be public and ought to be known, at least by the litigants. I think there needs to be more use of attorney fee awards when a party has acted inappropriately, brought frivolous lawsuits, or brought lawsuits for the wrong reasons. We do see that to a degree in the eminent domain, but what I also oftentimes see in attorney fee awards, they're pretty minimal. They are reduced down. They don't necessarily cover all the expert-related fees, and I think those all need to be looked at. And there's opportunity there by looking at them and making change to still protect our open courts so that the little guy can have their day in court, but yet some of the big bad actors don't continue to do and use the court systems inappropriately.
It seems to me like they're utilizing those rewards as an individual. So I guess my thinking is if, let's say an NGO wins a case, shouldn't that money be put towards the species instead of to their pocketbooks?
That would make sense.
Oh, right, a lot of sense. Ms. Byfield, you said something, I want to really rehash this. The Taylor Grazing Act uses several words, must and shall. So there's a big difference on that regards, right? So we could use that as a defense.
Are you talking about the multiple use of the lands? Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. There's, getting back to kind of the settlement of the Western lands, what was the purpose of these lands? When Congress decided to withdraw the lands from settlement, so they wouldn't be privatized, what Congress did was created really two sets of laws that govern our land system in America. The one are the multiple use lands, which were lands designed where we were to produce from those lands. The others were those that were to be protected, and we know those as the national parks, our national parks, sometimes wilderness areas, national wildlife refuges, but any of those areas that were going to be specifically protected and at least not used or limited use are set aside by Congress to those specific statutes. The remaining lands were there to be in multiple use production, which meant that a livestock grazer a rancher can be grazing the land, at the same time a miner can be mining that same land, at the same time timber production can be coming off of that land, at the same time recreationists can enjoy that land. And all of those things were supposed to happen at the same time. And when we have these federal agencies tell us that they have to lock down certain lands and you can't graze here, you can't mine here, you can't harvest timber here because they have to protect the lands, what those agencies are telling you is that they haven't done their job, because their job was to make sure all of those uses continued together in order to be productive lands.
Well, my last question, Attorney General. What if the permitting process was a date certain? So if you applied for this permit, it was date certain. So if the government didn't get their stuff done, it was already deemed a permit. Do you think that has a way to play in the scope of things?
You know, it's going to depend on the issue, but I'm going to tell you this with federal permitting. And I see it from when I was U.S. Attorney, and I've seen it as Attorney General. The federal process is challenging. There's a lot of extra government. There's a lot of extra opportunities to challenge things that maybe need to be going forward and maybe not stopping bad things that should be stopped. So my perspective as a state attorney general is that the federal government needs to do a better job with reducing the amount of government associated with permitting to allow good projects to go forward and to stop bad projects. Because if there's so much government involved, I don't think it's accomplishing either.
Hence, you get the resolution copper, which takes 30-some years to get from where they're trying for permits to the time they're even getting ready to start to produce copper. So I yield back, Mr. President.
Thank you. I'll ask my questions now. General Jackley, as Attorney General for the state of South Dakota, can you talk about how eminent domain, which is a huge issue in Congress, how eminent domain poses a substantial risk to the agriculture community and what can be done to counter the excessive use of it? And I want to be clear, there are instances when I believe, even as a big landowner, I've probably 1,500 acres of farmland. There are instances where, even if I don't like it, I think we have to use eminent domain. But it's being abused. It's being used excessively, in my opinion. What can be done to counter the excessive use of it?
You know, one of the things, and that's a great question, Mr. Chairman, and my state went through that as it pertained to a carbon pipeline. And at the end of the day, the legislature passed certain legislation, but the people of South Dakota spoke. They wanted to make sure there were certain protections in place against the abuse of eminent domain. And I think when you look at that, you have to consider there are instances when there has to be eminent domain for the public good. But there needs to be protections for its abuses, and those protections can exist by defining, certain uses, by looking at the economic side of it. Mm-hmm. They can be affected by, again, as I mentioned, the right to a jury trial versus a judge trial. So there are protections that could be put in place, and South Dakota has been engaged in that conversation, and I think the people of South Dakota have given pretty good direction on that, and we've improved our laws. They're not perfect, but they've improved, and I feel strongly that there needs to be those protections in place because some of the abuses that were occurring, and not every landowner can afford to hire a lawyer, to hire an expert, whether it be a surveyor or an appraiser, and I think those protections were necessary.
So, General, drawing on your experience as both Attorney General and U.S. Attorney for South Dakota, how have you seen the legal landscape change over time, particularly in terms of how agriculture producers are represented and targeted in litigation?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've seen increased hostility to our farmers and ranchers. We've seen it in some of the cases that I mentioned, both in the criminal prosecution and the civil cases. but I've seen much more adversarial setting when I truly believe the farmers and ranchers should be partners with the government, partners in land projects, in conservation, in getting good production, in making sure it's safe production, in being able to produce what our markets need. And I think we've lost our way, so to speak. And you use these examples, especially with the other panel members, and you can see that's happened, and it's time to take that back, to encourage and recognizing that farming and ranching is an important heritage across our country. It's what put food on the table, and that we need to be working towards partnerships to strengthen that, to strengthen our equality. And I think that would be important.
Very good. Mr. Sullivan, building on your opening statement, what part of your experiences do you think people outside the ag community most consistently misunderstand about agriculture lawfare?
About
And when we say
agriculture
people
lawfare.
outside the ag community, we're talking about every single one of these chairs. If they had people sitting in it, they don't have any clue what the ag community is. They get their food at the grocery store, use a lot of government assistance. They have no idea where food comes from and what all's involved in the American farmer producing that food. So
Yeah, I think that what you just said is absolutely correct, and I've said it a million times. Once we get 3 generations removed from our food production supply or the knowledge of where your food comes from, we lose that perspective of what's so important. It ties us to who we are. It ties us to the Constitution, back to where we came from. And with that, you have seen an increase in lawfare because they don't value that access to private property. They're collectivists. They don't know any different. We have infiltrated that. We have taught that into the schools, and it's an interwoven diabolical web, Chairman, and we've got to change course really quick, and that includes in the education system. Corporate America must change. We have to, as people, as ground level local people, we have to take back our sovereignty. That's one of the most important things that we can do right now, and defend our liberty and freedom. And then our government is from the bottom up. It's not from the top down. And what we see in the European Union, what we've seen in Sri Lanka, that is top-down control of production methods. And it is being pushed through the United Nations and the World Economic Forum with their Sustainable Development Goals. And to be honest with you, it is an anti-animal, anti-human ideology.
Ms. Byfield, you've dealt firsthand with weaponization of government against small family farms. What would you say are the most severe consequences of agricultural lawfare looking forward?
You mean if we don't change it?
Mm-hmm.
We're going to run out we won't have people to grow our food. I mean, it's going to be that simple because it's impossible to do. You know, getting back to your question on eminent domain, because our case was a takings case. The Constitution does allow for the federal government to take property for a public purpose. But how that has been morphed and defined is that if somebody else can make more money off of the property than you can growing the food, then it justifies that public purpose. And we saw that in the carbon sequestration pipelines. Mm-hmm. We just heard it from Representative Burleson on the Missouri transmission line. That was about who was going to make more money off of that project, the landowners or the net zero people. Right. And that's been going on for a long time. And if there is a way that Congress can rein that in, what is a public purpose? I like what South Dakota did, where they defined the carbon as a non-commodity, which meant their laws will allow a pipeline and land to be condemned for a commodity which does serve a public purpose. But by defining carbon as a non-commodity, then they couldn't use condemnation to take people's lands for them.
Very good. There are multiple actors, including government and environmental advocacy groups, engaging in agriculture lawfare. In your view, what are the primary motivations behind these efforts?
Well, it's control, it's money, it's agenda. I really kind of categorize this 3 ways. People are usually motivated by cause, power, or money. And in this case, we have all of those groups coming together to take the land. Those who are interested in money want the land because it's the source of all wealth, the first source of wealth. And those who want to control people, they want the land because whoever controls the land controls the government. And then those who are just in it for the cause, that they believe that people shouldn't be entitled to make decisions over their land, but there needs to be an oligarch or a higher power that makes that decision, always of which they are in charge of, then they too want that. So we have all these three elements serving that purpose and coming together at once.
My next to last question, I'm going to have a last question for all of you, but going back to your opening statement, one of the things that you said that struck me is the government came in and took your cattle. Did I get that right?
You got that right.
What did they do with those cattle? And how many cattle are we talking about, roughly?
So that's a pretty funny story.
You said they came in, sent in a bunch of cowboys, got them in a corral, had semis waiting there, or trucks with gooseneck trailers. I mean, explain to me what happened.
So this is very open country with very few fences. And our
Very
cattle,
different than my land, yeah. In Kentucky, in Tennessee, I have some in Tennessee.
our cattle were semi-wild, so they're actually hard to gather.
Mine are too, but, in a different way. I get it.
So they ended up gathering 100 head of cattle, but they had no place to put them. So they had to hold them in our private pastures. And the district ranger, who organized the confiscation, after he was done, he came down to our ranch house, and Dad actually at that point wouldn't let him on our private property, so he met him out at the edge of our private property. And District Ranger Grider handed him a bill for $26,000. And Dad said, well, what's this for? And he said, well, you pay this, you can get your cattle back. And Dad said, you got them in there, you get them out. Because he had confiscated those cattle without a court order and without a brand inspection, two things that made it completely unlawful. So Grider was kind of in a pickle because he wasn't expecting that response. It took him 3 days, but he finally got trucks in there to haul the cattle out. They loaded him up, took him to the Fallon sale yard, dropped him off there. The Fallon sale yard owner said, where's your brand inspection? And who owns?
Said what now?
Where's your brand inspection and
branded,
who owns
yeah,
these
okay.
cattle? And because he didn't have that, the sale yard owner said, I can't sell these.
Right.
He said, I will feed them, I will make sure they're not harmed, but you get them out of here as soon as you can. So Grider had to load him up once again, and he took him to the BLM horse sale yard outside of Reno, Nevada. And then he auctioned those cattle off himself. One buyer there did ask, where's the brand inspector? And he said, he's supposed to be here, wait a minute. So he steps away, makes the phone call, comes back, and he says, well, he can't make it, he got delayed, but he said, my signature's as good as any on this bill of sale. So he sells the cattle. When we got all of them in deposition in our takings case, the brand inspector made sure he had proof he was nowhere near, did not take a phone call, and had absolutely no say in what Grider did.
That's so bad. That's one of the worst lawfare stories I've heard. So each of you all, this is for the whole panel, each of you all have had your own individual experiences with agricultural lawfare, ranging from eminent domain issues to aggressive litigation. What do each of you believe is the most aggressive lawfare tactic used against farmers and landowners, and what can be done to prevent it? And I'll start with you, General.
I think because of the harshness of a criminal prosecution, it would be that. The concept that a rancher or farmer would be subject to a criminal federal prosecution, jail, is very serious. And I think when you overall look at the stories, and you've heard about them today where the criminal court system has been used, I would say that is probably the most serious. And then it goes back to the way to prevent that is accountability and transparency. And that, obviously the Moreau River case that I talked about earlier, affected over 100 ranchers. It did affect their safety, and their livelihoods, but they weren't threatened to be put in jail. And we just reserve that here in America for the worst of the worst in the most serious cases. And I say that as a former U.S. attorney and attorney general.
Okay. Mr. Sullivan?
Yeah, I think one of the most damaging things is the mind games, the mental games that they play, the threats. I mean, it's mentally taxing. Not that they don't have, or we don't have enough on our plates already, but when you know that they're in the wrong and they're in that wrong position, and then you start questioning that. Well, are they wrong or are we wrong? And then it turns into years, like the Hage story and our story. And ultimately, in my opinion, it was the beginning of the end for my dad. It was so stressful. And these people have no power, but then they get you confused, and you're like, well, maybe they do have power, you know. So I think that's one of the things that really is the big problem. And then, of course, these partnerships with the environmental organizations, I cannot stress that enough. These are the most dangerous partnerships on the face of the planet.
All right. Ms. Byfield?
Well, I would double down on that one. My mother passed away at age 54, and she was in great shape. I mean, I have her physique. She was not overweight. She was well-conditioned, but, you know, that very first season when we had the 70 knocks on our front door claiming a violation, she's the one who was at home having to take those calls and having to deal with that. She died out of stress. She died had a heart attack and a severe stroke, and it was all stress brought on by the federal government. So I would double down on that. But I would say the other thing that is so crippling when you're in this situation, and I hear it from landowners today that are in this situation, they have no way to fight back. The system is absolutely against them. They have to go through the administrative system that's set up to be lawful in that system. And when they do that, they get ground up. And even when they win, they don't win anything. They just come back and they do it over and over and over again because they know they can last you. They know they can grind you up, and eventually you're going to run out of business. So I think you feel like you have both hands tied behind your back and you have no way to defend yourself. That is creating the environment where we've seen it, like with the Bundy family. That is who the representative was alluding to. When they came in to confiscate his cattle, they had a court order. I mean, because, and it was out of frustration that he had fought for so hard that finally he just turned his cattle out and said, come get me. You know I have the right to graze. And, you know, it's putting people in a position where they have to operate outside of the law in order to feed their families. And that's the dangerous point we're at right now. But that's also the position that the environmentalists are working to set up. That's exactly the position they want our landowners in.
Well, I really appreciate your all's testimony today. This is a priority for Secretary of Agriculture Brooke Rollins. We are concerned about a weaponized federal government, state government, and some local government going after our farmers and landowners. It's unacceptable. There's no industry in America or in the world more important than agriculture. I would argue agriculture is the most important issue for our national security. We have to have food to eat. That's the #1 priority, and a lot of members in Congress don't understand that. If you look at the map of America, most congressional districts now have few to zero farmers in that congressional district. If you're a member of Congress and you don't represent very many people involved in agriculture, then that you tend to not worry yourself that much about agriculture when everybody depends on agriculture every day. We want to do something about the lawfare, the weaponization. This committee will continue to work with Secretary Rollins, and hopefully we can try to pass some legislation and use our ability as a high-profile committee to amplify the challenge that our farmers and ranchers are facing every day. And your testimony today will be very helpful. We'll do everything we can to spread the word. And if you have any ideas, don't hesitate to reach out to us. I know you've given us several examples of legislation that could be proposed and passed, and we will try to do that. This committee's serious about reining in an unelected bureaucracy that tend to be liberal in ideology. They tend to be urban, and they tend to have absolutely no understanding or appreciation of agriculture. So we understand that on this side of the aisle, and we're going to do everything we can to work with the Department of Agriculture and Secretary Rollins. This is a window of opportunity. Who knows what the world's going to look like? Who knows what this body's going to look like in 7 or 8 months? Who knows what the White House will look like in 2.5 years? So we need to act now, and we understand that. Thank you all for being here, and with that, I will declare this roundtable